Section 17 of Gray's Anatomy, Part 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulay. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 5, by Henry Gray. The Abdomen, Part 2. Horizontal disposition of the peritoneum. Below the transverse colon the arrangement is simple, as it includes only the main cavity. Above the level of the transverse colon it is more complicated on account of the existence of the omental bursa. Below the transverse colon it may be considered in the two regions, viz., in the pelvis and in the abdomen proper. In the pelvis. The peritoneum here follows closely the surfaces of the pelvic viscera and the inequalities of the pelvic walls, and presents important differences in the two sexes. A. In the male, it encircles the sigmoid colon, from which it is reflected to the posterior wall of the pelvis as a fold, the sigmoid mesocolon. It then leaves the sides, and finally, the front of the rectum, and is continued on to the upper ends of the seminal vesicles and the bladder. On either side of the rectum it forms a fossa, the pararectal fossa, which varies in size with the distension of the rectum. In front of the rectum, the peritoneum forms the rectovesical excavation, which is limited laterally by the peritoneal folds extending from the sides of the bladder to the rectum and the sacrum. These folds are known from their position as the rectovesical or sacrogenital folds. The peritoneum of the anterior pelvic wall covers the superior surface of the bladder, and on either side of this viscus forms a depression, termed the paravesical fossa, which is limited laterally by the fold of peritoneum covering the ductus deferens. The size of this fossa is dependent on the state of distension of the bladder. When the bladder is empty, a variable fold of peritoneum, the plica vesicalis transversa, divides the fossa into two portions. On the peritoneum between the paravesical and pararectal fossae, the only elevations are those produced by the ureters and the hypogastric vessels. B. In the female, pararectal and paravesical fossae similar to those in the male are present. The lateral limit of the paravesical fossa is the peritoneum investing the round ligament of the uterus. The rectovesical excavation is, however, divided by the uterus and vagina into a small anterior vesicouterine and a large, deep posterior rectouterine excavation. The sacrogenital folds form the margins of the latter, and are continued on to the back of the uterus to form a transverse fold, the torus uterinus. The broad ligaments extend from the sides of the uterus to the lateral walls of the pelvis. They contain in their free margins the uterine tubes, and in their posterior layers the ovaries. Below, the broad ligaments are continuous with the peritoneum on the lateral walls of the pelvis. On the lateral pelvic wall, behind the attachment of the broad ligament, in the angle between the elevations produced by the diverging hypogastric and external iliac vessels, is a slight fossa, the ovarian fossa, in which the ovary normally lies. In the lower abdomen. Starting with the linea alba, below the level of the transverse colon, and tracing the continuity of the peritoneum in a horizontal direction to the right, the membrane covers the inner surface of the abdominal wall almost as far as the lateral border of the quadratus lumborum. It encloses the cecum and the vermiform process, and is reflected over the sides and front of the ascending colon. It may then be traced over the duodenum, sosus major, and inferior vena cava toward the middle line, whence it passes along the mesenteric vessels to invest the small intestine, and back again to the large vessels in front of the vertebral column, forming the mesentery, between the layers of which are contained the mesenteric blood vessels, lacteals, and glands. It is then continued over the left sosus. It covers the sides and front of the descending colon, and, reaching the abdominal wall, is carried on it to the middle line. The upper abdomen. Above the transverse colon, the omental bursa is superadded to the general sac, and the communication of the two cavities with one another through the epiploic foramen can be demonstrated. A. Main cavity. Commencing on the posterior abdominal wall at the inferior vena cava, the peritoneum may be followed to the right over the front of the suprarenal gland and the upper part of the right kidney onto the anterolateral abdominal wall. From the middle line of the anterior wall, a backwardly directed fold encircles the obliterated umbilical vein and forms the falciform ligament of the liver. Continuing to the left, the peritoneum lines the anterolateral abdominal wall and covers the lateral part of the front of the left kidney, and is reflected to the posterior border of the hilus of the spleen as the posterior layer of the phrenicolenal ligament. It can then be traced around the surface of the spleen to the front of the hilus, and thence to the cardiac end of the greater curvature of the stomach as the anterior layer of the gastroleonal ligament. It covers the antero-superior surfaces of the stomach and commencement of the duodenum, and extends up from the lesser curvature of the stomach to the liver as the anterior layer of the lesser omentum. B. Omental bursa, bursa omentalis, lesser peritoneal sac. On the posterior abdominal wall, the peritoneum of the general cavity is continuous with that of the omental bursa in front of the inferior vena cava. Starting from here, the bursa may be traced across the aorta and over the medial part of the front of the left kidney and diaphragm to the hilus of the spleen as the anterior layer of the phrenicolenal ligament. From the spleen it is reflected to the stomach as the posterior layer of the gastrosplenic ligament. It covers the postero-inferior surfaces of the stomach and commencement of the duodenum, and extends upward to the liver as the posterior layer of the lesser omentum. The right margin of this layer is continuous around the hepatic artery, bile duct, and portal vein, with the wall of the general cavity. The epiploic foramen, foramen epiploicum, foramen of Winslow, is the passage of communication between the general cavity and the omental bursa. It is bounded in front by the free border of the lesser omentum, with the common bile duct, hepatic artery, and portal vein between its two layers, behind by the peritoneum covering the inferior vena cava, above by the peritoneum on the caudate process of the liver, and below by the peritoneum covering the commencement of the duodenum and the hepatic artery, the latter passing forward below the foramen before ascending between the two layers of the lesser omentum. The boundaries of the omental bursa will now be evident. It is bounded in front, from above downward, by the caudate lobe of the liver, the lesser omentum, the stomach, and the anterior two layers of the greater omentum. Behind, it is limited, from below upward, by the two posterior layers of the greater omentum, the transverse colon, and the ascending layer of the transverse mesocolon, the upper surface of the pancreas, the left suprarenal gland, and the upper end of the left kidney. To the right of the esophageal opening of the stomach, it is formed by that part of the diaphragm which supports the caudate lobe of the liver. Laterally, the bursa extends from the epiploic foramen to the spleen, where it is limited by the phrenicolenal and gastroleonal ligaments. The omental bursa, therefore, consists of a series of pouches or recesses to which the following terms are applied. 1. The vestibule, a narrow channel continued from the epiploic foramen over the head of the pancreas to the gastropancreatic fold. This fold extends from the omental turbosity of the pancreas to the right side of the fundus of the stomach, and contains the left gastric artery and coronary vein. 2. The superior omental recess, between the caudate lobe of the liver and the diaphragm. 3. The lienal recess, between the spleen and the stomach. 4. The inferior omental recess, which comprises the remainder of the bursa. In the fetus, the bursa reaches as low as the free margin of the greater omentum, but in the adult its vertical extent is usually more limited owing to adhesions between the layers of the omentum. During a considerable part of fetal life, the transverse colon is suspended from the posterior abdominal wall by a mesentery of its own, the two posterior layers of the greater omentum passing at this stage in front of the colon. This condition occasionally persists throughout life, but as a rule adhesion occurs between the mesentery of the transverse colon and the posterior layer of the greater omentum, with the result that the colon appears to receive its peritoneal covering by the splitting of the two posterior layers of the latter fold. In the adult the omental bursts